Imagine it. The golden age of Hollywood, where the spotlight burns hot and the rules are written by men in suits. The screens are whitewashed, the stars mostly silent, and the immigrant dream is often just that. A dream. But into this carefully curated fantasy bursts a woman who was loud, defiant, and impossible to ignore. Her name was Lupe Vélez. Before she was nicknamed the Mexican Spitfire, before the tabloids devoured her every move, and long before her tragic, scandal-ridden death became a grotesque Hollywood myth, Lupe was just Maria Guadalupe Villalobos Velez. Born in 1908 in San Luis Potosi, Mexico, Lupe came from privilege. Her father was a colonel, her mother a woman of society. But comfort didn't mean conformity, and Lupe didn't take kindly to rules. Even as a girl, she was unpredictable, wild, theatrical, and endlessly curious. She studied at a convent school, but it didn't last. She fought, she danced, she talked back. She wasn't a rebel without a cause, she was a rebel without a leash. While most young women were trained to be demure, Lupe dreamed of being watched, admired, and remembered. And so, when Hollywood began casting its greedy eyes toward exotic beauty in the 1920s, Lupe Vélez saw her opening, and she didn't wait for permission to take it. She started in Mexican vaudeville, performing in local revues and theater productions. By the time she hit 18, Lupe was stunning, magnetic, and completely untrained. And that made her dangerous in all the right ways. She was a bolt of lightning wrapped in satin. When she arrived in Los Angeles, her Spanish accent was thick, her English nearly non-existent, but her presence, undeniable. And then she caught the attention of Hal Roach, the comedy kingpin behind Laurel and Hardy. He gave her small roles in slapstick shorts, and Lupe devoured them. She was fast, funny, and completely unafraid to look ridiculous. Rare traits for a woman in a business built on glamour and obedience. Critics took notice. So did audiences. And soon, so did D.W. Griffith. Griffith, the self-anointed genius behind Birth of a Nation, cast Lupe in Lady of the Pavements, 1929, a romantic drama that gave her real dramatic meat, and more importantly, a chance to speak. The silent era was ending, and Lupe, with her expressive face and that now infamous accent, was ready to make some noise. She transitioned into talkies with an energy that felt volcanic. While other actresses stumbled trying to find their voices, Lupe screamed, sang, sobbed, and seduced. She was impossible to dub, impossible to mold, and producers both loved and loathed her for it. By 1930, Lupe Vélez was a star. She lit up the screen with unfiltered fire, lusty, loud, and completely unpredictable. She didn't play refined women or cool blondes. She played women on the edge. Her characters slapped back, threw things, wept in public, and demanded attention. And audiences couldn't look away. But Lupe didn't just play fire. She was fire, and that would be both her superpower and her downfall. The press dubbed her the Mexican Spitfire, a name that stuck, for better or worse. It was meant as a compliment, a branding tool, a way to make her marketable to white American audiences. But it was also a cage. From that moment on, Lupe Vélez wasn't allowed to be soft or subtle or sad. She was expected to be a stereotype. Tempestuous, seductive, irrational. Hollywood loved her loudness. Until it didn't. But for a time, she basked in it. She made films that brought her global fame. The Gaucho, Hell Harbor, and eventually, the comedy series The Mexican Spitfire that would forever cement her image. She wore diamonds, drove expensive cars, and flirted with the biggest stars of the day. Her laugh could turn heads in a crowded room. Her rage could clear it. She had arrived. But fame in Hollywood is fickle, and for a Latina woman with a sharp tongue and no interest in playing nice, the spotlight never lasts long. The same fire that made Lupe Vélez unforgettable would eventually burn her life to the ground. Because Hollywood doesn't like women it can't control. And Lupe Vélez was uncontrollable. By the early 1930s, Lupe Vélez wasn't just in Hollywood, she was shaking it to its core. While other actresses smiled politely and played along with the studio machine, Lupe kicked it in the shins, laughed in its face, and then stormed out of the room in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and Spanish obscenities. She wasn't America's sweetheart. She wasn't anyone's sweetheart. She was a cyclone with ruby lips, flashing eyes, and absolutely no patience for hypocrisy. And in a town that built its reputation on illusions, Lupe Vélez had the nerve to be real. Off-screen, she was even more explosive than on. She threw tantrums in public. She flung glasses at lovers and fists at rivals. She laughed loudly, cursed fluently, and flirted shamelessly. She didn't care who you were. If you crossed her, you'd know it. Directors feared her. Men were obsessed with her. And the press? The press devoured her. She didn't just defy expectations, she obliterated them. Reporters at the time said Lupe had the face of an angel and the mouth of a dockworker. But that wasn't quite fair. Her mouth was sharper than any sailor's. She used it to charm, to seduce, and to eviscerate. She didn't just insult people, she demolished them with poetry. Her public feuds were legendary. If an actress dared to steal her spotlight or a man dared to humiliate her, Lupe would go after them with fire and fury. There's one infamous story. At a dinner party, Lupe reportedly grew bored and tossed a plate of spaghetti across the table at another guest. No real reason. She just felt like it. The room went silent. Lupe giggled, and that night she made every gossip column in America. Another time, after a blazing row with Gary Cooper, more on him soon, Lupe allegedly pulled a gun from her purse and fired it into the air outside his house. When the neighbors screamed and the police arrived, Lupe didn't flinch. She was crying, but still glamorous, still composed, still terrifying. To some, it looked like madness, but to Lupe, it was power. She refused to be tamed. Hollywood had created its own monster, and now it didn't know what to do with her. Studio bosses tried to manage her, tried to scold her, suspend her, threaten her. It didn't work. Lupe was too proud, too independent, and too damn famous to be easily replaced. Still, they didn't stop trying. She was pigeonholed into the Latin firebrand role, the hot-tempered girlfriend, the wild foreign beauty, the shrieking comic relief. It paid well, yes, but it boxed her in. She wasn't being asked to act anymore. She was being asked to explode on cue. And sometimes she did. On set, Lupe could be brilliant or impossible, or both. She memorized lines quickly and delivered them with volcanic energy. But if she didn't like a script, a co-star, or even the temperature in her dressing room, she'd storm off set or refuse to work. At least once, she threatened to quit mid-production unless she was allowed to rewrite her own dialogue. Her producers gave in. What else could they do? She wasn't just a star. She was a headline factory. Lupe Vélez became the first Latina actress to successfully lead her own franchise with the Mexican Spitfire film series, a wild, fast-talking comedy string that made her a household name. But even as the films rolled out, her roles stayed stagnant. She was the hot mess, the feisty vixen, the punchline. And Lupe, no matter how much she played along, knew exactly what was happening. She once told an interviewer, "I'm sick of this wild woman routine. They put me in a cage and expect me to roar. Maybe I'm tired of roaring." But she couldn't stop. Because roaring was the only thing Hollywood would let her do. By the mid-1930s, Lupe had become more infamous for her antics than her acting. The parties, the feuds, the affairs, it all blurred into a whirlwind of chaos. She was Hollywood's wild child, and the town loved her for it. Until it didn't. Because in Hollywood, being wild is only endearing until you start falling. And Lupe Vélez was about to fall. Hard. If Lupe Vélez was a wildfire in public, she was an inferno in private. Her lovers were many. Actors, musicians, athletes, producers. And each affair was more volatile than the last. She didn't do quiet devotion. She did passion, obsession, heartbreak, and fury. For Lupe, love wasn't a safe harbor. It was a battlefield, and she never entered it without weapons drawn. But no romance in her life burned hotter or more destructively than the one she had with Gary Cooper. Ah, Coop. To the world, he was the tall, all-American heartthrob with the silent strength of a cowboy and the jawline of a Greek statue. But to Lupe Vélez, he was something else entirely. A man she wanted to possess. Body, heart, and soul. And she very nearly did. They met in the late 1920s on the set of Wolf's Song. Sparks didn't just fly. They ignited a firestorm. Lupe and Gary fell into a love affair so intense, so combustible, it made headlines before the film even wrapped. She was wild, he was reserved. She screamed, he brooded. And somehow it worked, until it didn't. From the start, their relationship was a powder keg. They fought constantly, in public and in private. Lupe would hurl plates, insults, and threats. Cooper would disappear for days, then show up like nothing happened. She accused him of cheating. He accused her of spying. They made love. They made war. They were addicted to each other, and it was killing them both. Lupe was obsessed. She trailed him, called him relentlessly, even reportedly hired people to follow him when she suspected infidelity. And Cooper? He ran, often literally. When things got too heated, he'd pack a bag, hop a train, and vanish into the desert for days. He called her insane. She called him her soul. At one point, after yet another brutal breakup, Lupe allegedly showed up at Cooper's home in a rage. She beat on the door, screaming his name. When he wouldn't come out, she fired a gun into the air to get his attention. The neighbors called the police. Lupe just laughed. And yet they always got back together. Even when his mother tried to intervene. In fact, Mrs. Cooper hated Lupe with a quiet fury. She once referred to her as that wild Mexican and begged Gary to break things off for good. Lupe, in response, allegedly cornered the woman at a party and told her in no uncertain terms that if she didn't back off, she'd be sorry. But even Lupe couldn't fight a mother's influence forever. Eventually, Gary Cooper ended it. For real. He chose career over chaos, silence over storm. He moved on to safer women, quieter homes, less scandal. And Lupe? She was shattered. Some say she never got over him. Others say she swore to never let a man humiliate her like that again. But Lupe wasn't built for solitude. She continued to seek love the only way she knew how. Loudly, completely, destructively. Her list of lovers reads like a guest list for the golden age of Hollywood's most scandalous dinner party. Eric Maria Remarque, the author of All Quiet on the Western Front. Lupe allegedly poured champagne on his typewriter when he ignored her. Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic swimmer turned Tarzan actor. She married him in 1933, and it was a disaster from the honeymoon onward. They fought in restaurants, on yachts, in hotel lobbies. He once tried to leave her mid-vacation, and she reportedly dove into the ocean, fully clothed, and swam after the boat screaming, "You coward, you can't leave me." When they finally divorced in 1939, Weissmuller looked like he'd survived a war. Lupe, ever the showwoman, told reporters she would never marry again, unless it was to a man with the backbone to handle her. She kept dating, of course, but with each affair, her reputation worsened. The press painted her as unhinged, unstable, dangerous. Never mind the betrayal, the loneliness, the studios who discarded her like an old costume. Lupe was always to blame. A woman scorned, a woman too wild to love. And yet, beneath all the rage, beneath the drama, there was always the same desperate, aching need. To be seen, to be chosen, to be loved, not for the fire she brought into the room, but for the smoke she hid behind her eyes. Her final lover would not be a famous leading man. He wouldn't be a studio boss or a celebrated novelist. No. By the early 1940s, Lupe's star had dimmed, and the names in her bed were no longer printed in bold type. Which brings us to Harold Ramond, a little-known actor, her final devastating heartbreak, and the beginning of the end. By the mid-1930s, Lupe Velez was famous, but not for the reasons she wanted. She had once dared to dream of becoming a great actress, a Mexican Sarah Bernhardt, a fiery Dietrich, a woman who could command the screen with depth and dignity. But Hollywood had other plans. It didn't want Lupe Vélez, the artist. It wanted Lupe Vélez, the Mexican Spitfire, loud, hot-tempered, and exotic. And once it had squeezed every laugh and box office dollar from that image, it began to move on, without her. The very persona that had made her a star was now her prison. She was always the other woman, never the ingenue. Always the Spitfire, never the starlet. She was wild, unpredictable, emotional, great for comedy, terrible for prestige. As new faces entered the scene, soft-spoken blondes, doe-eyed Americans, Lupe found herself fading into caricature. The industry had changed, and it no longer had room for a woman like her. She could feel it happening. Each studio meeting felt colder, the roles became smaller, the paychecks thinner, directors stopped returning calls. Her name in the trades went from bold to barely mentioned. Suddenly, the producers who once praised her fire now called her difficult. The journalists who once flocked to her table now rolled their eyes. She was, they said, too much. But Lupe knew better. It wasn't just that she was too much, it was that she was too real. She had dared to age, to speak her mind, to love recklessly and rage publicly. She didn't hide her flaws behind studio-approved smiles. And in Hollywood, that was unforgivable. So she did what she always did. She fought back. In 1939, when most actresses her age were being cast as mothers or mistresses, Lupe reinvented herself one last time with the Mexican Spitfire film series, a screwball comedy franchise that turned her into a whirlwind of broken English, flustered hot-bloodedness, and endless misunderstandings. It was a hit. The public loved her all over again. But Lupe hated it. Sure, the films paid well. And yes, they brought her name back to marquees across the country. But every time she stepped into the role of Carmelita Lindsay, the wild, jealous Latina wife with a thick accent and a hot temper, she felt a little piece of her soul die. She was parodying herself, becoming the clown in her own tragedy. And worse, she knew it. Behind the scenes, Lupe would cry between takes. She begged writers to give Carmelita more depth, more dignity. "Why does she always have to yell?" she asked one director. "Why can't she win once in a while?" But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The Spitfire sold tickets because she was predictable, because the audience laughed at her, not with her. By the time the final Mexican Spitfire film wrapped in 1943, Lupe was exhausted. She had become a joke, a relic of an earlier, wilder Hollywood. A Latina woman in her mid-30s, unmarried, unruly, and out of favor. And in a town that thrived on youth and silence, she was both aging and loud. Her phone rang less and less. Studio offers dried up. Even her lovers, who once chased her like paparazzi, began to ghost her. They were younger now. Easier. Less fire, more polish. Lupe's star was flickering, and she knew it. So she did what any showgirl might do when the stage lights start to dim. She tried to orchestrate one last, grand performance. She began talking to the press again. Told them she had a new fiancé, that she was pregnant, that she was planning a wedding, a comeback, a whole new chapter. She posed for photos with shopping bags and smiles. She leaned into the narrative of rebirth. But behind the bright lipstick and wide eyes, the truth was far darker. Her fiancé, actor Harold Ramond, was no dashing leading man. He was younger, less famous, and far less invested. And her pregnancy? It wasn't part of a fairy tale. It was a scandal in the making. Because in 1944, an unmarried Latina woman expecting a child in the judgmental glare of Hollywood society wasn't romantic. It was ruinous. Lupe had spent a decade fighting for her place in Hollywood. Now, with everything collapsing, she faced the greatest horror of all: obscurity. She once told a friend, "I'd rather die than be forgotten." And whether she meant it metaphorically or not, she was already planning the next act. Not a comeback, but a final curtain. By late 1944, Lupe Vélez was preparing for a show, but it wasn't one that would play in theaters. It wasn't scripted by a studio or directed by anyone but herself. This was Lupe's last role, and she would play it the only way she knew how, to the hilt. On paper, everything looked beautiful. She was engaged to actor Harold Ramond, a man so handsome, so photogenic, he might have been sculpted in the MGM backlot. She was pregnant with his child. There were rumors of a wedding being planned, of a quiet future somewhere far from the Klieg lights. The papers buzzed with speculation. Was Lupe finally settling down? Was the Spitfire becoming a lady? But behind the doors of her lavish Beverly Hills home, the truth bled through the glamour like a cracked mirror. Harold Ramond didn't want the baby. Worse, he didn't want her. Whether it was her age, her volatility, or her fading career, something in Lupe no longer dazzled him the way it had when they first met. And Lupe, always so bold, so loud, so alive, felt it. She felt slipping away. She'd been here before. She knew the signs, the half-hearted kisses, the excuses, the sudden coldness. And then came the ultimate humiliation. He refused to marry her. In that moment, Lupe Vélez wasn't a star. She wasn't the Mexican Spitfire or the darling of the tabloids. She was a woman, alone, pregnant, abandoned, and in 1940s Hollywood, that meant disgrace. Public shame, career death. Lupe had survived a lot. She had clawed her way from San Luis Potosi to the hills of Los Angeles. She had fought the studios, the critics, the racism, the ageism, and her own inner chaos. But this was too much. She wouldn't survive scandal. She would not be pitied. So, on the night of December 13th, 1944, Lupe Vélez took control of the narrative one final time. She lit candles all over her bedroom, laid out silk sheets and satin pillows. She dressed in her finest lingerie, white, lace-trimmed, immaculate. She applied makeup, rouge, eyeliner, lipstick. She curled her hair. And then she wrote notes. One for her housekeeper, another for Harold Ramond, and a final, heartbreaking letter for her unborn child. In it, she explained that she could not bring a baby into a world where its mother was disgraced, that she loved it desperately, that this wasn't its fault, that she hoped somehow it would understand. Then she poured herself a glass of brandy and swallowed 75 Seconal tablets. When she was found the next morning, Lupe Vélez looked like a sleeping starlet. Her bed was pristine, her body posed just so, her face calm, almost serene. It was the kind of death Hollywood had always promised its tragic queens. Beautiful, dramatic, cinematic. But that's not the story most people tell. Because somewhere along the line, fact and legend collided. A rumor began to spread. A lurid, grotesque myth that Lupe had not died in bed. That instead the pills made her nauseous. That she staggered to the bathroom. That she tripped. That she drowned in her toilet. It was a lie. A cruel, tasteless fabrication. And yet, it spread like wildfire. Comedians turned it into a punchline. Gossip columns winked at it. It became the stuff of Hollywood horror lore. The idea that Lupe Vélez, this grand, tragic, fiery woman, had died in a bathroom instead of on her terms somehow seemed too delicious for the tabloids to resist. But the truth? The truth is far more haunting. Lupe Vélez choreographed her death like she would a scene, with candles, music, lingerie, and letters. It was a performance. Not for sympathy, not for revenge, but for legacy. If she couldn't live with dignity, she would die with it. And yet, Hollywood stole even that from her. Her funeral was small. A few stars showed up. Some didn't. She was buried in Glendale, far from the sound stages she once ruled. And within weeks, the studios had moved on. The magazines stopped printing her name. The audiences stopped remembering her. But the Spitfire didn't vanish completely. She lingered, in whispered stories, in old reels, in that impossible smile that could break hearts and camera lenses at once. Lupe Vélez died because she believed she had no place left in the world that made her. But maybe, just maybe, she still had one in the world that remembered her. And decades later, we're still trying to untangle the myth from the woman, the legend from the life, the punchline from the pain. Because Lupe Vélez wasn't a joke. She was a force. And she didn't just live fast and die young. She burned, bright, wild, and unforgettable. When Lupe Vélez was laid to rest, it wasn't under a spotlight. There were no crowds screaming her name, no grand procession fit for one of Hollywood's first Latina icons. The applause had long since faded. The velvet curtain had fallen. But the performance wasn't over. Because Lupe's story, twisted, retold, sensationalized, was just beginning its afterlife. In the years that followed, Velez became less of a woman and more of a whisper, a punchline, a cautionary tale. Her name, once lit in marquees and etched in gossip columns, now lived mostly in jokes told by men who had never known her, and myths written by people who never cared to ask if they were true. The infamous toilet death became legend, spread with glee across dinner parties and film schools. People chuckled over it, referenced it in books, quipped about it in interviews. "Did you hear about Lupe Vélez?" they'd say, like it was just another quirky footnote in Hollywood's bizarre folklore. They erased her carefully staged exit. They mocked her deepest despair. And in doing so, they did something far crueler than killing her. They turned her into farce. But legends, as Lupe knew, don't die quietly, and hers refused to stay buried. In the late 20th century, as Hollywood began confronting its legacy of racism, sexism, and the erasure of non-white pioneers, a new wave of critics and historians started to revisit Lupe's life. Not as a joke, but as a tragedy, a rebellion, a raw, unvarnished mirror of a woman who had dared to be everything Hollywood didn't know what to do with. They saw her not as the Mexican Spitfire, but as one of the first Latina actresses to truly make it. On her own terms, with her own fire. They looked beyond the caricature and found a woman who had clawed through the barbed wire of typecasting and xenophobia, with nothing but charm and rage. They saw the artistry beneath the chaos, the intelligence behind the tantrums, the pain buried under the performance. Suddenly, Lupe Velez wasn't just a wild child or a manic lover. She was a trailblazer, a woman who had loved loudly, suffered deeply, and refused to be small. And her death? Her tragic, beautifully staged, deliberately orchestrated final act? It became a symbol, not of failure, but of the impossible pressures faced by women in the golden age of Hollywood. Of what it meant to be seen constantly, yet never truly known. Of what happened to those who didn't fit the mold, who weren't willing to play nice or stay quiet. Modern Latinx actors and filmmakers have begun to cite her as a painful but powerful figure, a ghost in the machine of the entertainment industry. Salma Hayek once named Lupe as both inspiration and cautionary tale. In academic circles, Lupe is now studied as part of the long, fraught history of Latina representation in American cinema. She's no longer just a footnote. She's a chapter. Yet the tension still lingers, between the myth and the woman, between the truth and the tale, between the glitter and the grief. Because Lupe Velez's story isn't just about how she lived or died. It's about why we remembered her the way we did, and what that says about us. Why was it so easy for the world to laugh at her pain? Why did the public prefer a humiliating lie to a heartbreaking truth? And why, after all these years, do we still struggle to allow women, especially Latina women, the right to be complicated, angry, vulnerable, and unforgettable without turning them into cartoons? Lupe Velez burned too bright for the era that birthed her. But maybe now, in the long echo of her life, we can finally see her clearly. Not as the caricature they created, but as the blazing force she really was. She was not a joke. She was not a failure. She was a star, a meteor across the Hollywood sky, brief, breathtaking, and impossible to ignore. And long after the laughter dies out, her story still crackles in the air, daring us to remember her not for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived. They called her a wildfire. Uncontainable, unpredictable, too much, too loud, too emotional, too sexual, too Latina. Lupe Velez was everything the world wasn't ready for, and she knew it. She was the kind of woman who didn't ask for space. She demanded it. The kind who'd walk into a room and make kings and cowards tremble just the same. The kind of woman couldn't look away from, even when it hurt. But being that woman came at a cost. For every laugh she gave, there was a tear she hid. For every headline, a heartbreak. For every kiss thrown at the camera, a slap behind closed doors. Lupe performed. Always, even in pain, even at the end. And when the world turned its back on her, when it labeled her too difficult, too wild, too foreign, she did the only thing she could. She took control of the ending. Not because she was weak, but because the world had left her no space to be anything but perfect or punished. No room for a woman who refused to shrink. Her death was turned into a joke. But her life? It was a revolution. A messy, glittering, gut-wrenching rebellion against every limitation the industry, the patriarchy, and the public tried to place on her. She didn't play their game. She rewrote it, screamed through it, set it on fire. And though they tried to bury her story under lies, the truth still blazes. That she mattered. That she changed things. That she paved the way for every woman who would come after, daring to be loud, proud, fiery, and real. So tonight, if you remember Lupe Vélez, don't remember the myth. Remember the woman. The warrior, the comedienne, the lover, the fighter, the immigrant who lit up Hollywood with a laugh you couldn't fake and a rage you couldn't silence. She didn't just die in defiance. She lived in it. And even now, decades later, her flame has never truly gone out. Because legends like Lupe Vélez, they don't fade quietly into the dark. They burn forever.